The wind rattled the loose shutters like a warning that no one inside cared to hear. The Hayes farmhouse leaned hard into the night, its timbers moaning, its roof patched with tar and tin. Cold slid through the cracks as though the house had long ago given up trying to keep it out. Inside, Clara Hayes moved quietly along the edge of the room, her hands busy with work that didn't matter folding already, folded linens, straightening chairs that would only be kicked aside again. At 28, she was already old in their eyes, too thin from grief, too silent from carrying words no one wanted to hear. Her husband had been gone a year, pneumonia taking him as fast as it had once taken his father. When he died, they stopped calling her wife. They began calling her widow, though they never said it kindly. The name came with a sharpness, a sneer, as if she had chosen to outlive him. They said she had cursed him, same as she had cursed her own womb. No children had ever come, no laughter at the table, no swaddled promise of a legacy. That was her fault, they decided, and what the Hayes decided was law within these walls. That evening, supper was thin and bitter. Clara ate little, keeping her eyes lowered, listening as the men complained about debts and weather while the women hissed low words meant for her ears alone. Useless. Empty. A burden carried too long. She pressed her lips together, not answering. Silence had become her only defense. It wasn't enough. When the men pushed back from the table, stomping to the porch for their smoke, Clara felt the sudden grip on her arm. Her sister-in-law, Martha, older by 10 years and twice as cruel, dragged her to her feet. "Come," Martha muttered, voice sharp with drink and spite. Clara tried to pull back, but the woman's fingers bit into her wrist like iron. No one stopped it. No one even asked. The other women smirked. The men outside laughed at something that had nothing to do with her, and still she was dragged through the kitchen door into the yard. The cold met her first, sharp as a blade, burning her cheeks. The yard was dark, the only light spilling from the farmhouse windows, yellow squares cut into the night. Martha shoved her against the wood pile. From her apron she pulled shears, the kind meant for sheep. Clara's heart thudded, but she didn't plead. She only lifted her chin. "You think you're still a Hayes?" Martha sneered, breath sour in the cold. "A wife with no child is nothing. A widow with no shame is worse." The shears bit close, snapping through long strands of Clara's hair. It fell in uneven clumps to the frozen ground, each cut loud in the silence. Wind carried the strands into the dark like smoke. Clara stood still, the cold seeping deeper, her body rigid but unbroken. When Martha was finished, she grabbed a pail of ashes from the barrel by the porch leftovers from the fire and smeared them across Clara's face, black streaks painting her cheeks, grinding into her lips, her skin. "There," Martha spat. "Now you look the way you should, marked, known." Clara didn't cry. Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. She breathed slow, steady, through the taste of ash. The wind pressed at her ragged hair, lifted the broken strands still clinging to her collar. Martha waited for her to collapse, to sob, to beg. She didn't. When the door slammed shut behind her sister-in-law, leaving her alone in the yard, Clara stayed where she was. Silent. Ash-streaked. Stripped of dignity, but not of strength. The barn loomed nearby, the animals shifting restlessly inside, their warmth muffled behind wooden walls. She pressed her hands together, fingers trembling not from fear, but from the cold, and lifted her gaze to the ridge beyond the fields where the wind roamed free. Her shame was loud tonight, but deep inside her chest, something quieter stirred, something that refused to die. The ridge caught the last of the light, turning the line of pines into dark spires against a fading sky. Jonas Ward sat his horse at the crest, the animal shifting under him, breath pluming into the cold. From where he rode he could see the Hayes homestead, smoke lifting thin and mean from its chimney, curling like a signal no one answered. The place looked as hard as the people who lived in it, boards weathered gray, fences sagging, the whole farm leaning into the wind as though too stubborn to fall. Jonas had no business watching, but his eyes kept drifting that way, the same as they had for years. He had a scar down the side of his jaw, pale against the stubble that never quite left his face. Folks said he got it in a gunfight outside Santa Fe, others swore it was an Apache blade. Jonas never corrected them. Let people believe what they wanted it, kept them at a distance. And distance was the only thing he trusted anymore. His cabin lay another mile west, a single-room shelter tucked into the trees, where no one came unless they lost their way. That was how he liked it. But tonight the wind carried whispers he couldn't shut out. A ranch hand passing through town had stopped him at the feed store, mentioned something cruel with a shake of his head. The Hays had turned their grief into spite, and Cloroth widow was paying for it. Jonas hadn't replied then, only nodded, but the words had sat heavy since, rolling around in the silence he lived in. He had seen Clara a handful of times before, quiet as the dawn, her eyes always lowered, her face worn thin by work and sorrow. She had walked through town with her hair braided neat, her back straight, never speaking more than a polite greeting. She hadn't looked broken, not then. Now he heard they had cut her hair themselves, hacked it ragged with shears, smeared ash across her face in the yard like she was something to mock. The thought sat wrong in his gut. He'd seen men die for less insult than that, seen women vanish into the hard earth, with no one left to carry their name. And here she was, still standing under their roof, still enduring it in silence. Jonas shifted in his saddle, jaw tight. He told himself it wasn't his concern. A man living alone had no place stepping into another family's business, no matter how cruel. The Hays were known for their temper, for drinking hard and swinging mean. To cross them was to stir trouble best left buried. He'd kept clear for years, and it had kept him alive. But as he looked down from the ridge, watching that thin smoke rise, the memory of Clara's eyes came back to him. Not their color, not their shape, but the way they carried quiet. A quiet that wasn't weakness but endurance. He knew that kind of quiet. He'd lived with it ever since fever had taken his wife and child from him, leaving him to mend fences and talk only to horses. It was the kind of quiet that could hollow a person clean through if no one saw it. Jonas let the reins slide through his fingers, his horse snorting into the cold. The land stretched wide and empty around him, snow patching the ground, sky heavy with the weight of another storm. He should have turned back, ridden home, banked the fire, and shut the door against it all. That was what he always did. Instead, the barn smelled of dust and hay, a sharp sweetness that clung to every board. It was no place for a woman to sleep, but it was where they had pushed her, tossing her blanket on the straw as though she were no better than the animals. Clara stood a long while in the doorway, the cold seeping through her thin dress, watching the pale moonlight spill through the cracks in the siding. Behind her, the farmhouse windows glowed faint, voices carrying across the yard. Laughter mixed with the scrape of chairs and the slam of bottles on wood. They had eaten their fill, left her the crusts. She could still taste the sour scrape of them in her mouth, each bite chewed slow so it would last. Her husband's family no longer bothered to hide their plans. She had heard them talk as if she were deaf, selling off the herd first, then the fields, keeping the coin among themselves. She'll get nothing, Martha had said, and the others nodded. Best she find her own way, but Clara had no way. No bloodkin left, no friends willing to risk the Hayes' wrath. Her world had shrunk to this patch of land and the cruelty that fed on it. She crossed the barn to the far stall where the old mare stood. The horse lifted her head, ears twitching, and let out a low sound deep in her throat. Clara laid her hand on the animal's neck, feeling the rough winter coat, the steady warmth beneath. The mare had once been her husband's pride, but now no one tended her save Clara. She pulled a brush from the rail and began working through the tangles, each stroke slow, steady, a rhythm against the storm in her chest. Tears came before she could stop them. They slipped down her cheeks, hot against skin still raw from ash, falling into the horse's mane. "I don't know how much longer," she whispered, her voice breaking in the stillness. The mare shifted, pressing close as though she understood, and Clara buried her face against the animal's neck. Her hair, hacked short and uneven, brushed against coarse hide. Shame and grief mixed until she could not tell them apart. The night grew colder. Wind pushed at the walls, rattling the loose boards, but Clara kept brushing, kept moving her hand until the mare's coat shone dull in the lamplight. She told herself she would endure one more day, one more night. That was how she had lived since the funeral, measuring her survival in fragments, never daring to look beyond. She thought of the woman she had been before, with her hair long and her voice still carrying hope, and it felt like someone else's life. The voices in the house rose, men arguing now, then falling to laughter again. They did not think of her, not really. She was a shadow in their barn, a mouth to feed when scraps were left. She pressed her forehead to the mare's and closed her eyes. "If I could walk away, I would," she whispered. The horse breathed against her cheek, a soft exhale that felt like agreement. She pulled her blanket around her shoulders and curled into the straw at the mare's feet, listening to the slow rhythm of hooves shifting on wood, the steady breath that anchored her against the dark. Tomorrow would come. She would rise again to face it, though the weight on her shoulders threatened to crush her. For the first time she admitted it to herself, she was running out of days to endure. The frost lay thick across the ground, silvering the grass and stiffening the boards of the porch until every step creaked like old bones. Jonas Ward rode slow through the early light, the gray gelding beneath him moving careful on his bad leg. The limp left a crooked trail behind them, hoofprints dragging through the thin crust of ice, marking the path to the Hayes homestead as plain as a ledger. Jonas had been here before, years past, though never welcome. The place looked smaller in the dawn-lean fences sagging, smoke clawing out of the chimney like it wanted to escape. He reined in at the yard, swung down, and let the gelding breathe steam into the cold. His boots crunched hard against the frost as he mounted the steps. For a moment, he stood still, listening. Inside there was movement, the clatter of dishes, the scrape of a chair, the muffled rhythm of men's voices. He didn't knock polite, his fist hit the door like a hammer. It opened fast, and there stood Virgil Hayes, one of the brothers by marriage, his face long and mean, lips already curling into a sneer. "Ward," he said, drawing out the name like a bad taste. "What's a man like you doing on our porch this early?" Jonas's eyes were steady, the brim of his hat low against the pale sun. His hand rested at his side, fingers loose, not threatening, not yet. His voice was even, gravel deepened by silence. "She's coming with me." The words dropped between them heavy as iron, no explanation, no kindness, just truth. Virgil barked a laugh sharp enough to draw the others. Boots thudded against the floorboards, and soon 2 more men appeared behind him, both broad in the shoulders, both carrying the same mean smirk. They looked at Jonas like he was a joke come to their door. "Coming with you?" Virgil said, leaning on the frame. "You got it twisted. She don't belong to you." Jonas didn't blink. "She don't belong to you either." That stripped the laughter from the air for a beat. Then, one of the others spat into the yard. "You gone soft for a barren widow, Ward? Thought you were smarter than that. You know what folks will say?" Jonas's hand shifted, his thumb brushing the worn grip of his revolver. The men noticed. The sneers faltered, though none of them moved back. The morning seemed to hold its breath. Even the gray horse, standing quiet in the yard, stilled as though waiting. "I don't care what folks say," Jonas answered. His voice was low, calm, carrying more weight for not being raised. "She's leaving here today. You can step aside, or you can find out how fast this ends when a man's got nothing to lose." The men bristled, shoulders squaring, pride itching for a fight. But Jonas didn't shift, didn't fidget. He stood like stone, the kind of stone that had weathered storms without cracking. His eyes stayed locked on Virgil, steady and cold. From the barnyard came a sound Thena horse stirring, hooves striking wood. Clara stepped into view, her thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, hair hacked ragged, ash still faint on her skin. She froze at the sight, her eyes darting from the men in the doorway to Jonas on the steps. Jonas tipped his head once toward her, a gesture, small but sure. His voice carried across the yard like a line cast into water. You ready? The air grew sharper still, like the whole morning was waiting on her answer. The yard was brittle with frost, every blade of grass edged in white, the earth beneath hard as stone. Clara stood in the center of it, barefoot in the cold, her blanket sagging from her shoulders. The ragged ends of her hair clung to her face, uneven as if hacked by spite, and the streaks of ash still marked her skin like bruises that would not wash away. She felt the men's eyes on her husband's kin, their smirks sharp as knives, their laughter low and cutting. She had grown used to their scorn, to being treated as something less than human, but this was different. This was a reckoning, and she was the one caught in its center. Jonas Ward did not move from the porch step. His hand rested near his revolver, his frame tall and still as the ridge he had ridden down from. When his gaze met hers, it was not pity she saw. Pity had been handed to her before, bitter as spoiled milk, and she wanted none of it. What Jonas gave her was steadiness, a recognition that cut through the ash and the shame. He saw her, not as broken, not as a burden, but as someone standing on the edge of a choice. You can stay here and die slow, Jonas said, his voice carrying in the cold. Or ride with me and take your chances. The words rang harder than any blow. Clara's heart beat so loud she could hear it against her ribs. Behind her, Virgil laughed, mean and mocking. Hear that? Loner Ward's come to steal our ghost. Let him have Herschel curse his house same as she did ours. Another voice chimed in, sharp and bitter. She won't last a week. Ain't fit for more than sweeping floors and crying over graves. The men jeered louder, their contempt thick as the smoke rolling from the chimney. Clara felt the heat of their words clawing at her back, but she kept her eyes forward. Jonas hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. He wasn't bargaining, wasn't begging. He had put the choice in her hands, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the weight of her life rested with her alone. Her breath shook in the cold. She thought of the barn where they made her sleep, the scraps thrown her way as though she were no more than a dog. She thought of the way Martha's hands had twisted in her hair, shears snapping, the sting of ash pressed into her skin. She thought of nights lying awake, whispering to a horse because no one else would listen, wondering how much longer she could endure. Jonas's eyes held hers, dark and steady. He was not promising safety. He was not promising love. Only a chance, rough and unsteady as the trail itself. Clara's body felt heavy as lead, her feet numb in the frost. For a moment she wavered, fear pulling her back toward the house, habit whispering that survival meant submission. But something else moved beneath that fear, something stubborn and sharp that had survived every cruelty they had thrown her way. She lifted her chin, though it trembled, and stepped forward. The laughter cut off sudden, replaced by a hiss of anger. Virgil cursed, his boots scraping against the threshold, but Jonas's hand shifted, and the revolver gleamed in the pale light. No one dared push farther. Clara crossed the yard one step at a time until she reached the porch. The air felt different there now, warmer but freer. Jonas didn't touch her, didn't guide her. He only gave the faintest nod, as if to say the choice had already remade her. Behind them, the Hayes men muttered like wolves cheated of prey. Ahead, the gray gelding waited, breath clouding the morning air. Clara drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders and took another step toward the horse, each movement small but certain. She did not look back. The gelding picked its way carefully up the ridge, hooves sinking into the softened frost, breath blowing in pale bursts. Jonas rode silent, his shoulders squared against the cold, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Clara sat behind him, the thin blanket wrapped tight, her hands gripping the worn leather of the saddle. She had not ridden double since she was a girl, and the strangeness of it pressed on her as much as the ache in her bones. The house she had left fell smaller with every step, until it was just a smudge in the valley, smoke curling thin and gray against the sky. She did not look back. The climb was steep, the air sharp with pine and stone. Her hair, jagged from the shears, whipped against her cheeks, and she let it. For the first time in months, no one was pulling at it. No one was marking her face with ashes. Only the wind touched her now, and though it stung, it felt clean. Jonas said nothing, and neither did she. The silence rode with them, heavy but not cruel, like a third presence between them that knew words would only cheapen what had already been chosen. By the time they crested the ridge, the light was fading to a bruised gold. Jonas's land spread out before them, rough and wide, the kind of country that could break a person or save them depending on how they met it. He guided the gelding down a slope lined with spruce and into a clearing where a cabin stood alone, smoke rising thin from its chimney. The place looked built from the bones of the landlogs hand-hewn, roof patched with care, shutters worn but holding. It was no grand house, but it stood solid against the wind, and to Clara's eyes, it looked more like a home than any she had known since before her husband's death. Jonas dismounted, boots crunching, and offered his hand. She hesitated, then took it. His grip was rough, calloused but steady as iron. He led her inside, pushing open the heavy door. The cabin smelled of leather and pine smoke, a low fire smoldering in the hearth. The air was warmer than she expected, filled with the faint sweetness of resin. Jonas moved with quiet efficiency, setting aside his coat, pulling a pot from the hook above the coals. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, only worked as though he'd been expecting her. Clara stood near the door, the cold still clinging to her, her eyes tracing the space the simple bed against the wall, shelves stacked with jars and tools, a rifle resting in the corner. Nothing soft, nothing wasted, but nothing cruel either. When he set a tin cup in her hands, steam rising from it, her fingers trembled around the heat. The broth was thin but rich, tasting of marrow and herbs. She hadn't eaten more than scraps in weeks, and the warmth slid through her like a memory she had almost forgotten. She bowed her head over it, not in prayer, but in something close. She did not thank him aloud. She couldn't yet. But the way her hands shook around the cup, the way she drank slow and careful, as if afraid it might vanish, said enough. Jonas sat across the fire, his own cup untouched for a long while, watching without judgment. Outside, the wind pressed at the shutters, carrying the valley behind them into darkness. Inside, the silence stretched, but this silence was different. It was not empty. It held the beginning of something fragile, something that might yet take root in the ashes of all she had endured. The fire had burned low, coals glowing like buried embers, their heat reaching only so far into the corners of the cabin. Jonas sat in his chair by the hearth, sharpening a blade with steady, unhurried strokes. Clara lay on the bedroll he had given her, propped against the wall, the thin blanket pulled to her chin. The meal still lingered in her belly, warm enough to quiet the ache she had carried for months. Yet sleep wouldn't come. The silence stretched too long, broken only by the scrape of steel against stone and the sigh of the wind outside. She studied him in the flickering light. The scar on his jaw caught shadows, pale against weathered skin, a mark that looked as though it had been earned in violence but worn long enough to have turned into part of him. Most men with scars made them into stories, bragging about the fight that cut them. Jonas did not. He carried his as if it were no one's business, and maybe it wasn't. Still, Clara saw that the wound went deeper than his skin. It was in his eyes, tooth heaviness, the way he never looked too long at the fire, as though the flames reminded him of something he would rather keep buried. At length, Jonas set the blade aside, his hands resting loosely on his knees. His gaze stayed on the fire, though his voice, when it came, was rough with the sound of words not used in years. "My wife used to sit where you are." Clara did not move, not wanting to break whatever had loosened his tongue. "She died in the second winter," he went on, slow and halting. "Fever took her. Took our boy too. He wasn't but 5. He swallowed, jaw tightening. By the time the thaw came, there was nothing left to bury but wood for a marker. Clara lowered her eyes, her hands tightening around the edge of her blanket. She did not speak. Words like "I'm sorry" or "that's terrible" felt too small, too useless against grief carved so deep. She knew what it was to have people talk at her pain instead of sitting with it, so she stayed quiet, letting the silence carry what she could not give. Jonas shifted slightly in his chair, shoulders heavy, as though even the telling of it had dragged something long hidden into the open. "Don't speak of them much," he admitted. "Not to anyone. Feels like the world forgot soon as the ground froze over them. Maybe I wanted it that way." The fire snapped, filling the space where his voice had stopped. Clara lifted her gaze then, meeting his profile lit by the glow. She saw the hardness there, yes, but also the sorrow underneath, the kind that only time could temper, but never erase. She did not press him with questions. So long had he carried it. What had they been like? Did he still dream of them? She knew those were answers he guarded close. But she understood enough to know that speaking the barest pieces aloud was no small thing. Their silence settled again, but it was different now. It wasn't empty, nor was it cruel. It was shared, like two people standing at opposite ends of the same grave, each knowing the shape of loss without needing to describe it. Clara felt her own grief stir, the raw ache of a marriage gone and a life dismantled, and for the first time, she did not feel it alone. Jonas reached for the log beside him, fed it into the fire, and leaned back. His eyes flicked to hers briefly, acknowledging her presence without demand. Clara held that glance, steady as she could, before letting it rest again on the flames. The tether between them was thin, fragile, like thread pulled taut. But it was there, undeniable as the glow in the hearth, binding two solitary lives in a way neither had expected nor asked for. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Inside, grief had spoken, and silence had answered, leaving behind something that might just be the beginning of trust. By the end of the week, the town was speaking her name again, though not in kindness. Clara heard it in fragments carried back with Jonas after he rode down for supplies. She didn't need him to repeat the words. They clung to him when he stepped through the cabin door, settling into the room like dust that refused to be swept out. He kept his mouth shut, but the silence told her enough. Hayes' voices were loud in a town that thrived on gossip, and the story they spun grew like wildfire. She had been stolen, they said. Dragged off in the night by Jonas Ward, loner and gun hand, a man too long on the outside of decent folk. Some whispered she had gone willingly, which was worse. That she was no better than a beggar taking refuge in another man's bed. Every telling made her smaller, until she was nothing more than a tale traded across bar counters and church pews. The proof came the next time Jonas hitched the gray and rode to town. Clara waited by the window until he returned, a sack slung over his shoulder lighter than it should have been. He dropped it on the table, the sound of a half-empty bag louder than any word. Inside, flour. A strip of salt pork. Nothing else. The storekeep had refused to sell him more, muttering about debts and decency. Jonas had said nothing, just taken what was given and left, but his jaw was hard, his eyes storm dark. Clara didn't need to ask. She knew how doors closed when her name was spoken, how glances cut sharp when she walked down the street. She had lived under those eyes before. Still, the weight of it pressed harder now. Here she was in Jonas Ward's cabin, eating food others believed she had no right to, taking up space in a life already branded by loneliness. The knock came 3 nights later. Jonas opened the door to find Sheriff Kane standing on the porch, his hat pulled low, his coat dusted with trail grit. Kane was a man with a voice like gravel, steady but not unkind, and he shifted uncomfortably as he looked past Jonas to the firelit figure of Clara inside. "Ward," he said, not stepping in. "Word is you took Hayes's widow without asking. That's trouble brewing, and you know it. Folks are riled up. Best way to settle it is to send her back where she came from. Jonas leaned against the frame, saying nothing. Kane went on, voice quieter. I know you. You don't go looking for fights, but this one's gonna find you if you keep her here. Hayes boys are loud. Loud gets dangerous. Clara sat frozen, her hands clutching the blanket around her shoulders, though the fire was hot against her skin. Shame crawled up her throat, thick as smoke. She hadn't wanted Jonas to pay for her choice, hadn't wanted to bring his name into the mud already dragging hers, but she had heard every word. Kane's warning wasn't just for Jonas, it was for her too. She was a storm tied to his roof beam, and sooner or later, it would break. When the sheriff left, boots crunching into the night, Jonas closed the door with a slow, measured hand. His face gave nothing away, but the lines around his mouth were cut deep. Clara looked at him, wanting to speak, to apologize, to offer to leave before worse came, but no sound came out. Fear pressed her quiet, and the silence between them grew thick again, heavier than it had been before. The night was still, but for the restless sigh of the wind, a hush that carried the weight of something about to happen. Jonas had banked the fire low, the room lit soft in the glow of coals, when the sound of hooves broke through the quiet. Heavy, careless hooves pounding the frozen ground, too many to mistake for a neighbor passing late. Jonas rose slow, his chair scraping the floor, his shadow thrown long against the wall. Clara's heart lodged in her throat before she even heard the men's voices carrying across the yard. The Hayes brothers had come. Their shouts rolled ahead of them, rough with whiskey, sharp with anger. The thud of boots hit the ground, the jangle of spurs, the clatter of rifles being unhooked. Jonas didn't reach for his hat or coat, only his revolver. He checked the chamber with the ease of habit, then stepped to the door and pushed it open. The yard was washed in the pale sway of lantern light. One of the brothers had hung it from the barn beam, its flame trembling against the dark, throwing crooked shadows across the frozen dirt. 3 of them stood there, broad-shouldered, faces twisted with drink and spite. Clara recognized Virgil at their front, his mouth curled into the same sneer he'd worn the morning Jonas had taken her away. You've got something don't belong to you, Virgil called, his voice too loud, trying to carry over the thud of his own heartbeat. We've come to take her back. Jonas stepped onto the porch, revolver low at his side, his body still as stone. The gray gelding stamped once in the corral, sensing the charge in the air. She don't belong to you anymore, Jonas said, his voice flat, carrying no more weight than it needed. The men shifted, fury sparking in the way their shoulders squared, hands tightening on the butts of their guns. The lantern's light danced across iron, and for a moment, the night itself seemed to split along the line of what would come next. Clara stood inside, her whole body trembling, the blanket clutched tight in her fists. Every instinct told her to stay hidden, to let Jonas bear the weight, to let the men battle until one fell and the other claimed her fate. But something in her snapped against the thought. She had been silent too long, a shadow in her own life. If she let them speak for her now, it would never end. Her feet carried her forward before her mind could catch. She stepped out into the cold, the lantern light falling across her face, catching the uneven edge of her hair, the pale streaks of ash still haunting her skin. Her voice shook but did not break. I'm not going back. The words sliced through the night sharper than gunfire. The brothers blinked, startled, as though the widow they had once silenced had no right to speak. Virgil spat into the dirt, anger sparking wild. You think this loner's gonna save you? He ain't got land worth a damn, ain't got a name worth more than mud. Clara drew a breath, her chest rising against the blanket, and for the first time she met Virgil's sneer with steady eyes. I didn't choose land. I didn't choose a name. I chose to leave you, and I choose to stay. Jonas's revolver lifted then, not wavering, the barrel catching the flame's glow. The message in his eyes was clear on twitch, and the night would end in blood. The brothers shifted, the weight of their anger pressing against the fact of his steadiness. For a moment the world held, the air too thin to breathe. Then, with curses spit into the dirt and fury left unfinished, they backed away, mounting their horses with jerks of reins and muttered threats. When the hooves faded into the dark, Jonas lowered the revolver, the silence pressing hard again. Clara swayed where she stood, breath shaking out of her in clouds. She had spoken. She had chosen. And the truth of it rang louder than the fear still clenching her chest. Jonas glanced at her, his face unreadable, but there was the faintest nod, as if to say he had heard her, and that was enough. The night held stillness again, but it was no longer the same. Something had shifted, sharp as the edge of a blade, and nothing would turn it back. The yard held the echo of hooves long after the brothers had gone, their curses trailing into the night like smoke that would not clear. The lantern swayed against the barn beam, its flames sputtering in the wind, but no guns had fired, no blood had been spilled. Jonas stood on the porch a long moment, revolver still loose in his hand, his eyes tracking the dark ridge where the riders had vanished. Only when the silence returned, thick and certain, did he lower the weapon and step back inside. Clara was still standing near the door, her chest rising too fast, the blanket clutched to her shoulders as though it might hold her steady. She watched him shut the door with a slow firmness, watched him slide the iron bolt into place, and felt something unclench in her chest. For weeks she had lived braced for cruelty, for shame, for the weight of voices that sought to crush her. Now the danger had come and gone, leaving behind not victory exactly, but a space wide enough to breathe in. The fire in the hearth was low, shadows stretching tall across the cabin walls. Clara sank onto the chair nearest it, her body trembling with the aftershock of fear. Her hair hung jagged, strands uneven where Martha's shears had bitten deep, and her cheeks still bore the faint gray of ash no scrubbing had fully erased. She looked into the flames and saw herself reflected there, worn and marked, but alive. Jonas crossed the room without a word. He set the revolver on the table, then disappeared briefly into the corner where his tools lay. When he returned, he carried not a weapon but a wooden brush, its bristles worn, its handle polished smooth by years of use. He placed it in her hands without speaking, his rough fingers brushing hers only long enough to pass it. The gesture was plain, yet it landed in her chest heavier than all the threats shouted in the yard. Clara looked down at the brush, resting in her lap. For a moment her throat tightened, and she could not lift her eyes. He was not pitying her, not trying to soothe with empty words. He was giving her back what had been taken, her dignity, her right to tend herself, to be something more than what others had stripped away. Her hands trembled as she lifted the brush, pulling it through the uneven locks, wincing at the tangles. The sound of bristles moving through hair filled the silence, steady and rhythmic, a small act that felt like defiance. Jonas settled in the chair opposite, his gaze steady on the fire, not intruding, not asking. The room filled with a quiet that was no longer heavy, no longer cruel. It was a silence that held space, a silence that belonged to them both. Clara's strokes grew slower, her breath easing with each pull of the brush. She had not felt ownership of herself in so long that the simple act of grooming her hair felt like rebuilding something broken. The ash on her cheeks remained, faint shadows of humiliation, but she let them be. Scars did not vanish in a night. They stayed, like Jonas's own scar, proof of survival. When at last she set the brush down, her hands folded in her lap, she felt Jonas's eyes on her. She met them, and what passed between them needed no words. They had stepped across some line tonight, not into love, not yet, but into a beginning. A place where silence meant presence, not absence. A place where two people, each haunted by their own ghosts, could sit by the same fire and not feel alone. The cabin creaked in the wind, the lantern outside guttered low, and the world beyond remained sharp with threat. But inside, the air was different, softer. The kind of quiet that could grow into something steady. Clara leaned back against the chair, letting her shoulders rest for the first time in months, and watched the fire burn with the faintest hint of warmth blooming in her chest. It was not much, not yet, but it was enough, a different kind of home.